Norm Gaume. I love New Mexico. I'm a lifelong water guy. Water's been my profession and rivers have been my avocation. I've lived all over the state. I now reside in rural Sandoval County. I've been a water activist since 2014. I stopped working to oppose the Gila Diversion Project. I'm president of the Middle Rio Grande Water Advocates. I had, before I became an activist, I was director of the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission for 6 years, ending in 2002. And before that, I was water resources manager for the city of Albuquerque. And I'm very pleased to be presenting tonight with Kyle Harwood, who is a good friend and a longtime associate, even though he is a generation younger. Kyle?
Oh golly, I thought you were going to say because I'm a lawyer. Good, I got out of that one better than I thought. Well, good evening, everyone. This is a huge group. I know you've all come to listen to Gaume, but I'm going to go ahead and warm up the crowd. So I guess we have some people who are not muted. Cheryl Foote. There you go. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Kyle Harwood. I am a water resources lawyer in Santa Fe. I've been a lawyer doing this work for about 25 years. And before that, I have an interdisciplinary background with an undergrad in science from Cornell and a master's degree from UNM in water resources administration. It's been a great honor to work with Norm on various water projects and go rafting with him. And we're thrilled to, I guess, introduce the work of the task force this evening. So Norm's given his introduction. I've given my introduction, such as it is. And the way we're going to do this is I'm going to start and talk for a while about how we have a phone number who needs to mute, ending in 1866. See, Tom, can you mute that person for us?
Yes, if I can. Let's see. So what I'm going to do is mute everyone, Kyle, and then you're going to need to unmute yourself. Okay, here we go.
I can do that. Okay, great. Hopefully that works for the 146 people that we're hanging out with this evening. So what I was starting to say is that I'm going to introduce some of the underpinnings of the work of the task force that preceded our adventure this summer and this fall, and then hand it off to Norm after a while to talk to you about some of the forward-looking pieces. I don't think we've said this yet. We encourage you to go ahead and submit questions into the chat. We do have a couple of 350 New Mexico folks that are going to help us manage the questions. With a group of this size and the limited time we have, we're not sure how many of the questions we're going to get to, but it's really important to us that you send those questions in. We will have a little time at the end to do live Q&A. Depending on how our timing goes. But it's very important to us that you do register those questions so that we can collect them and try to sort out a response to help you all continue your own education on the water challenges that we're facing and the work of the task force. So the 29 people that were selected to be on this task force also signed up to be water ambassadors for the governor and the state engineer, Mike Hammond. And so that's part of Norm and I appearing this evening in front of you to talk about the work of the task force. And you have, as was already indicated, a series of talks with some of the other task force members later in the calendar. Okay. Without further discussion in general, I'll go ahead and share my screen. Bear with me one moment, please. Oops, that didn't go as planned. Some of us have gotten better at Zoom than others, so I appreciate your patience. Okay. Let's see where to start. The leap ahead analysis, this is affectionately called the leap ahead analysis. It is a wonderful document. I encourage all of you to read. It's only 125 pages, and it has a tremendous amount of information in it. It's been drafted by some of the leading water experts in the state who work at our esteemed, mostly at our esteemed public educational institutions and the United States Geologic Survey. You can see there the contributing authors from Tech, from UNM, from NMSU, and from the Geologic Survey. So this report was published in March of 22 and became the basis for a whole series of meetings and listening sessions on what this report covers, which is basically attempting to get our collective hands and heads around what aridification is likely to do to New Mexico and all of the hard water planning that we've done to date, and the even harder water planning that we're going to need to do going into the future. So these are just a couple of the initial pages from the, as I said, the affectionately referred to leap ahead analysis. I've highlighted a paragraph here that I'm going to read quickly just so that you can all get it kind of lodged in your brain. This report is a collaboration between the Bureau and the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission. It was carried out by the Bureau at the request of the Interstate Stream Commission in support of the development of a New Mexico 50-year water plan. And the purpose of the report is to provide a solid and scientifically based foundation about climate change in New Mexico over the next 5 decades, upon which to build the 50-year water plan. And the work of the Water Policy and Infrastructure Task Force, which is the group that Norm and I have served on this year, is a building upon and companion report to this report that's referenced here. So this just continues to give you a sense of the kind of folks that were involved, some very respected folks, and not just in New Mexico, including folks with regional expertise. I'm also just going to orient you just for a moment to the table of contents so you can get a sense of what this report covers. As I already warned you, it is 125 pages, but it's a wonderful 125 pages approximately for those of you who are interested in water. It obviously has an overview talking about projections on different components of our land and water landscape, soils, fire, erosion, surface and groundwater, gives projections of climate change in section 2, effects on the water budget, the land surface water budget, talks about the way that the terrestrial ecosystem and water resources interact with one another, impacts on soils, the landscape change, fire and erosion that was on, of course, everyone's minds this summer with all the massive fires we saw, both in northern and southern New Mexico. And then goes on to talk about how the changes in those supplies are going to impact the agricultural, municipal, and industrial users in the state. And I think this section 7, Norm will tell you what his favorite sections are if he wants to, but I think this section 7, you have to read the first part to build up to this, but section 7 is really where a lot of critical observations, I think, are made. And then we have how climate change may influence extreme precipitation events and the challenges to stormwater, which are very real. And then a chapter on water quality, which is only sometimes given the important focus that it really needs. We often get tied up talking about water quantity, and that's obviously critical, but the water quantity perspective is equally important. And then finally, the summary of impacts, and then the recommendations section, which is surprisingly short. So that's just a quick orientation to what I want to encourage all of you to read. If you read through this, and you'll have questions, of course, but when you get comfortable with this report, you will be in the top 1% of people who think and care about water, because this really does cover a lot of current and critical thinking and research, and summarizing the challenges that we're facing. I don't know if I mentioned this before. I am not going to be able to monitor the chat questions. So when I get sort of towards the end, I'll ask for some help on questions relating to my part of the presentation, but I'm not actually going to monitor the chat while I'm talking. So this is a page from the website regarding the 50-year water plan, and it is an important summary of kind of where we are. Again, what my part of the presentation is kind of looking immediately in the past on how we got to this task force and where we are here in November, almost December of this year. And Norm's going to sort of take us forward into what work is there to be done. But some of this will not be surprising to many of you. Whatever we used to think about the variability of water resources in New Mexico, you know, over the last 20 years, there's always been a debate, you know, climate change, yes or no, or are we within the standard range of variability that we see in New Mexico? Well, this study really settles that question and talks about the aridification that we are seeing and expecting to worsen, and how it's going to affect all aspects of New Mexico's economy and lifestyles. I'm reading the bottom of the first paragraph here: agriculture, tourism, industry, energy, and recreation. So this Leap Ahead report, developed by the Bureau, compiles, assesses, integrates all the existing peer-reviewed published research, technical reports, and data sets to take a look at New Mexico's climate over the next 50 years and the resultant impacts on water resources. So it's the scientific foundation of many of these interconnected efforts and reports. And when I say reports, we're not talking about things that are supposed to go and sit on the shelf somewhere. We're talking about documents that can be digested by a broad audience, that can be a call to action, that can be the basis for legislation, can be the basis for policies, and all those things that make our democracy function when we have an educated citizenry. So that's, again, my pitch for you to read the Leap Ahead report. So what we know is New Mexico's water future is or will be drier and more variable. It's a little hard to see the legend on this graph, but what that is showing down there is percent change in the water stress index, and the darker brown is up to 20%. So you can see, hopefully most of you are roughly oriented to the outline of New Mexico. They're kind of in, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but right in there. And you can see much of our state is covered by one or another color of brown, all of which is dire. On the Water Task Force, we talk a lot about whether we are being sanguine enough about the future. And I think particularly where Norm and I come down on this question is that you can't be too concerned about this issue. You don't want to be so concerned that it paralyzes you or it prevents you from taking needed action. I think that's very important, but this is serious stuff. And the reason why it's serious stuff is because we're expecting an average temperature rise of a number of degrees, lower stream flow and aquifer recharge, greater year-to-year variability in precipitation, hotter, more severe droughts, decreasing snowpack, earlier and diminishing runoff, greater demands on groundwater due to surface water shortfalls, stress on natural vegetation caused by increasing temperature and decreased water availability, increased forest fire frequency, increased flooding and sediment transport, and possible, irreversible damage to soils and degraded water quality. And this may sound like a laundry list of horribles, and it somewhat is. What's, I think, very important for all the audiences for this work to know is that the system was darn complicated and pretty well stressed out before these droughts that we're seeing now. We're seeing remarkable droughts, aridification, actually. We've been changing our language in the task force, and I need to do a better job. This increasing aridification, which we're seeing, is profound. It's profound on the Colorado River system. As many of you know, if you read the paper, it's in the paper just about definitely every week, sometimes every day. And we are having many of the same effects or experiencing many of the same impacts here in New Mexico as what is widely reported on the Colorado. So this is our challenge. So
Kyle, let me jump in there for just a second.
Thank you.
Can you go back to your previous slide?
Yes, sir.
The second bullet is lower stream flow and aquifer recharge. And there's a crucially important point there that I think you're going to hear more than once, maybe tonight. But what happens when you have lower stream flow and aquifer recharge together? Well, first of all, when you have lower stream flow, people who can't get their water from the river and from streams are going to want to pump their wells. So the stresses on the groundwater system increase. At the same time, that aquifer recharge is decreased because we have less water supply, surface water supply, to recharge our aquifers. So it basically is a double whammy on our aquifers. And so many of them in this state are the sole source of water for local communities. Our aquifers are in dire straits.
Thank you, Norm. That's a great point to emphasize. And it reminds me, I had something else to mention on this slide. So thank you for taking me back to this. Many of these challenges are both regular sorts of things that desert dwellers in Southwest the United States have dealt with. What I think is particularly important to realize is that we're anticipating all of these things to happen, and we don't totally know what the synergy or the catalyst is when we have both decreasing snowpack and an earlier runoff in combination with the increased temperatures, in combination with droughts that are significant. And then the forest fires, and then the flooding and the sediment transport. So one of the real challenges is how we're going to juggle managing all of these things that we're expecting to become more challenging. Now, I don't want this to be, like I said earlier, we wrestle on the task force with it being too depressing, but also wanting to tell what we understand the truth of these studies to be. So this is an unprecedented set of challenges, and I know that New Mexico is up for addressing them. And that's part of the planning process and part of talking to audiences such as you all, because it's going to take all of us working on these issues to manage this challenge. And who doesn't like a challenge? We all get stronger and smarter and more resilient through challenges. And that's what we're looking at. And we have to rise to that challenge. So, okay to go on, Norm? Okay. So this is water resilience. This has become, okay, when I went through the master's degree in water resource, I don't think we used water resiliency as a term. This is now our most favorite term. It's meant to embody both the capacity to change and actually changing, as well as continuing to sort of stay healthy and do the things that we're all trying to do with this limited resource of water. So it's the ability to anticipate, prepare for, and adapt to the changing conditions, to withstand, respond to, and recover rapidly from disruptions. The warming and the associated aridification will reduce availability, as Norm said, in both surface systems, and then compounding in groundwater systems as folks that use surface water go to groundwater for their supplies. And it risks, if we don't manage it properly, it has grave risks. And so there's Resiliency assessment was evaluated in 5 sectors: the upland watershed health, which is sort of where surface water is generated, recreation and quality of life, agricultural water, public system water, industrial, commercial, mining, and power, which is a very important sector in New Mexico. So there was specific outreach conducted. These are pages from the 50-year water plan website. And so that was captured. So the Venn diagram there that shows the overlap of these 5 circles. So generally in water resources grad school, you learn the top and the right 2 bubbles here as the 3-legged stool that we talk about. So it's very common to talk about the 3-legged stool. You've got to have the wet water in the natural system. You've got to have the right or access to get it from where it is to where you need it. And you've got to have the infrastructure to get it from one place to the other. So that's what water diversity is talking about. That's access and rights to water, the top one. You've got the water availability, that's the wet water. And then the infrastructure to get it from where it is to where you need it. And then what this Venn diagram adds to those classic 3 legs of the stool is then demand management, which is managing the use of water that you're supplying, which is critical, and adds the watershed health, where the water, particularly surface water, is generated for both surface water and aquifer recharge. So Norm, did you have anything you wanted to share on there?
You're good, Kyle.
Okay, great. So the 50-year water plan is being, developed and prepared sort of in parallel with the water policy and infrastructure task force work that Norm and I have been doing. So, I'm not going to go through all of this, but obviously the plan was developed in partnership with scientific communities, tribes, pueblos, and nations, ASECU groups, federal, state agencies, water users, and advocates. We need a 50-year water plan. I won't belabor that point. And there's been a fair amount of communication around the draft water plan, but we're all looking forward to more discussion on that. The New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission here sort of summarized the involvement that happened through the end of last year. This was coincident for many of you who follow water leadership in the state. This is coincident with the retirement of John D'Antonio as the state engineer, the selection of Mike Hammond as a water policy advisor to the governor, and then his fairly quick appointment as the state engineer. So that tracks through this time frame. And so the 50-year water plan is different from the state water plan. I'm not going to go into much detail about that, but the state water plan is a requirement of a statute and gets updated every 5 years and is a very ambitious document that kind of lives over here. And then we have the 50-year water plan, and we have the work of the water policy task force. It does do this does do a nice job of summarizing our current water use in the state, so you can tell who is going to perhaps feel the biggest changes from aridification and from the competition over water. You've got the agriculture, including livestock, percent at 77.5. This particular summary separates out evaporation of reservoirs, which sometimes has been lumped with agriculture, but also is used to help supply other uses than agriculture, like cities in some cases, or other users. So you've got the agriculture and the reservoir evaporation, which are 2 fairly big numbers. You've got the public water supply at 10%, and then our industrial and commercial mining power generation at 5%. So this last paragraph again emphasizes the 5 to 7 degree expected increase in average temperatures. I'll just segue off of here for a minute. what I have come to understand, particularly on the Colorado River system, where so much attention and effort has been spent recently, is that where this aridification really changes the way our water cycle works is the drying that happens in the fall. And that drying, because of that higher temperature that happens particularly in the fall, means that even an average snowpack can end up being a half or less, or well, ranging between full and half of the yield that we would expect in the reservoirs. Let me say that again more clearly. It's the dryness of the soils and the landscape in the fall that appears to be the mechanism by which aridification is really damaging our expectations for water. So we get even an average snowpack and we get half the water we expect in the reservoirs, in part because of this fall aridification that dries out the landscape such that even that normal snowpack gets used up, re-wetting the system before we see surface water in reservoirs. So that's, I think, important to understand. So aridification is the gradual change of a region from a wetter to drier climate. And here in New Mexico, where conditions are already dry, this will result in even drier climate than we're experiencing today. And aridification is different from drought in that aridification is a shift in the baseline, while drought is a deviation from that baseline. So it's important to be using those words in their technical meaning. So here, this is again 50-year water plan related, prepping the plan launch, doing the LEAP-ED analysis, which we spent quite a lot of time talking about already, this outreach, resilience, and assessment work, including tribal water summits and the New Mexico Water Research Institute, the WORRY conference, water dialogue meetings, developing the plan. And it's still sort of, as I understand it, still stuck in phase 5, which is a review of the draft plan. And so we're looking forward to more discussion about that. I think we're getting very close to the launching point for Norm's work. But before we get there, this is my favorite page. So I'm going to share this with you here a little bit. This is what we call the honeycomb diagram, affectionately. And I'm going to start with equity on the bottom right-hand side, the purple paragraph. So this is engagements with tribes, pueblos, and nations. Well, why is that important? They've been traditionally over, the last 200 years been kept out of the water conversation. They're increasingly involved with them now. We still have unresolved water right adjudications, which are critical. So engagement with those entities is so important. We obviously have protecting acequia culture, the use of surface water, very important, particularly in the northern part of the state and where acequias are located in other parts of the state. And optimizing alternative water sources, that's critical, and the continued planning and research. So that's the equity part of the 50-year water plan. Then we have stewardship, and this is so critical. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this concept. This is stewarding the resources that we have. So this is groundwater health, improving the health of lakes, rivers, and reservoirs, and then improving this upland watershed where surface water is generated, which is, of course, critical to surface water supplies and recharging aquifers. And then lastly, and frankly, my favorite one, the green one that's in the middle, which is sustainability. And this is where a lot of our actions are housed. So this is water conservation. This is educating New Mexicans on how to do more with less, and appropriate pricing of water, I think, as well. Modernizing the water infrastructure, so that's making sure that the pipes and the dams and the everything else that goes into water infrastructure is efficient and maintained and tuned to the supply and the demand. And then I guess I'll admit, as my focus as a water lawyer, is modernizing the administrative management of water, which is so important. So that is that. Let me quickly switch over to a couple of other comments that I'd like to share with you, and these are from our draft report. So the 29 task force members were from across the state in different sectors and different walks of life and different backgrounds and experiences. And we identified 4 core problems. Water supply, coping with the reality of climate change impacts on our already over allocated rivers and aquifers. Community capacity. So this is the capacity of our communities to manage this change and this challenge. State government capacity, which I think for the task force became a huge, oops, am I still sharing my screen? Sorry. State government capacity became a huge priority for the task force in terms of making sure that our state agencies can actually manage and implement what is necessary in this changing environment. And lastly, the watersheds and aquifers at risk. So this is, managing the risk to the natural system that both provides ecological services as well as places for us to recharge and recreate. Lastly, the proposed solutions cluster in 5 key areas. Again, it's building the capacity of the state agencies and the local entities to cope, funding those things adequately, providing the data and science to fill gaps in our understanding, and the Water Data Act that the Bureau is heading up implementation of is critical in that respect. Shout out to Stacy Timmons if she's on. Community engagement to make sure that this is not a top-down approach in imposing things on New Mexicans, but rather getting their participation in meeting this shared challenge. And then lastly, the water conservation that is so necessary that will allow us to do more, even more with less. And I think that the last part, if I get to leave you with one final thought, which I don't think I've mentioned yet, is this aridification is anticipated to reduce the available water supply to us all by about 25%. So if you think about learning that your personal household budget was going to have a 25% structural impact from however you make your living, you would need to do planning. You would need to rally the members of your household and find a way to survive and thrive with that reduction. And so hopefully that analogy brings it home that that's what we need to do as New Mexicans. Okay, I'm going to stop talking now and let Norm talk.
I want, before we move to Norm, I just want to capture at least one question before we get too far from the leap ahead analysis in the 50-year water plan. A couple of questions about how much input from Native Americans and Puebloans into the 50-year water plan process and outcome.
My understanding is that there was a lot of outreach for the 50-year water plan, and I know personally, and I'm sure Norm and the other task force members know that we had significant involvement on the water policy and infrastructure task force from our Native communities. So that I think is well covered, and the leaders from the Native communities were well represented and articulate in our process.
Thank you.
Okay, well, that was an easy question. Norm, you get all the hard ones.
There are more,
Okay.
but we will save more for the end.
Very good.
Norm, you're muted.
I recognize that voice telling you you're muted.
Thank you. Let me go ahead. So I hope you all see my screen. I'm going to present, it's very important when we talk about the recommendations to have the basis in the background that Kyle covered so well. And, I think that a few thoughts to keep in our head as we go through this is we really do have a very difficult problem, and it's going to require big changes in the way we manage and plan for our water future. If we're going to leave water for future generations, for intergenerational equity, and to also increase the equity and the access to water for all New Mexicans, that's going to be a pretty heavy lift. And I think one of the advances that we now have is that the Water Task Force recommendations show the way how we can equitably increase water resilience and reduce future water insecurity, which, if we don't reduce it, I think will bring economic insecurity. Thinking about where we are right now, Kyle talked about the governor's 50-year water plan and went over some of the highlights. The 50-year water plan, we hope, will be released any day now. I think it's complete, and I'm anxiously awaiting to see the final copy. The state engineers, water policy and infrastructure task force recommendations, we're talking about some of those tonight. There'll be another presentation by task force members, including the state engineer, on December 8th, as Ann mentioned previously. I know from my engagement with legislators over this last interim that the Legislative Finance Committee and Water and Natural Resources Committee of the legislature are interested and have been engaged. And I would leave you with this point right now, and I think it's maybe one of the most important things I want to emphasize, is that whether or not we make this important pivot from the water management status quo, which I think will lead us to disaster, I think it's existentially important that we make these changes. It will be the governor and the 2023 legislators, the 2023 legislature, that we're depending on to actually make the pivot. The Water Policy and Infrastructure Task Force was appointed by the state engineer at the direction of the governor earlier this year. We started meeting, I believe, in June, but our process really didn't get going good until the last several months. I think this picture is of the task force meeting at the Rio Grande Nature Center. As Kyle mentioned, we had a very diverse group. Task force members included 5 cabinet secretaries or their proxies, including the New Mexico Department of Indian Affairs, Secretary Trujillo and Laurie Wiaki participated, along with 2 other Pueblo members. We had a lot of discussions. We got to know each other through that process, and we were able to come to a unanimous agreement on most of the recommendations that the task force is putting forward, 17 of them. Most of those were unanimously supported. As Kyle mentioned, the task force boiled down the problems into 4 core areas. We have problems with our declining water supply, which we're overusing right now, and which will continue to diminish as a function of climate change. We don't have adequate community capacity in many respects. Small rural communities don't have the capacity to operate and maintain the infrastructure they have, even if it's upgraded. The capacity to plan and manage resources is insufficient at the local level, and that is a big core problem. State government capacity to manage and help us plan for our water future is very inadequate. Former Governor Martinez slashed the water management agencies, and the capacity has not been restored, and we need even more. And then the fourth core problem is without action, our watersheds, rivers, and aquifers are at very substantial risk. We are overusing them, and our watersheds are deteriorating. There are three work groups, or three groups. The task force self-organized basically into three groups. One that dealt with local capacity, local infrastructure. One that dealt with water management and planning as a whole. And the third, which addressed river, watershed, and aquifer health. The presentation that is scheduled for December 8th is going to focus on local capacity and on river, watershed, and aquifer health. And so I'm not going to really get into those tonight. This presentation focuses on the water management and planning recommendations. And to boil those down, there are recommendations that address the state engineer and the Interstate Stream Commission's focus, capacity to do the work we need them to do, and the accountability for getting that work done. We need to reduce and manage the substantial gap between the water demand and a resilient, the water supply and a resilient level of water demand. We have a gap that we have to close. The Environment Department and the Natural Resources Trustee need additional capacity to protect water quality. We need to reinvent regional water resilience planning in New Mexico. It was highest priority task force recommendation that we renew and we regenerate our regional water resilience planning. We recommended a state water resilience fund to leverage federal infrastructure funding, which is copious today. We need to provide for resilient agriculture. And lastly, we need to manage groundwater for resilience. I have a series of slides I'm going to present to you now. They start with the exact language of recommendations that will appear in the report. These recommendations are final, and the report is almost ready to go. I'm not sure why it hasn't been released yet, but I took the liberty to actually copy the recommendations. I'm not using the rest of the language so that you can see what they say. Recommendation 2.1 calls for us to ensure a water resilient future for New Mexico. We need to empower state water management agencies. We need to transform and fund them to meet our growing water management challenges, which include water scarcity, aridification, supply and demand imbalances, contaminants of emerging concern, and equity. And this is all about pivoting from a water management perspective in the state that frankly dates back to the 1930s and 40s, or even older than that. Those approaches and those laws have served their purpose, but we are well beyond them. We've not yet pivoted to focus what water management we need for the water of New Mexico's water challenges in the 21st century. But that's what the Task Force Water Management and Planning recommendations are all about. And in terms of 2023 legislation and funding, which I'm personally focused on right now, and related to recommendation 2.1, we need to update the OSE-ISC mission, focus, modernization, capacity, and accountability. And specifically to speak to that, the agencies need more staff and they need the resources They can't even utilize the existing statutory tools that the legislature has passed over the last several years. So the legislature has actually given the state engineer some great tools, but there's no capacity to apply those tools and to make them work to improve New Mexico's water future. The information systems that the state agencies rely on are obsolete. Their legacy, they've got to be upgraded immediately. Many of the agency's business processes require modernization. They still use paper records. We still have paper files of essential information. So a combination of modernizing the business processes and the information systems will lead to increased agency employee productivity. Now, what manager of a business doesn't invest in making their staff as productive as they can be? And I guess the answer right now is the state of New Mexico, and we need to fix that. The state engineer needs practical enforcement authority. And to be specific, the state engineer needs the enforcement authority that the New Mexico Environment Department has. But with the existing authority, the penalties are so low and the enforcement processes are so difficult, involving lawsuits. The state engineer would have to bring a lawsuit to enforce against illegal water use. That it's really just not practical. And all that needs to be done is to give the state engineer the enforcement authority that the New Mexico Environment Department already has. The state recently, with flush resources, has a lot of money that it has appropriated for local water infrastructure projects. But the whole project financing and the ability to put projects on the ground are totally out of balance. So the recommendations include emphasizing project implementation. And this is particularly important for rural communities in New Mexico. Rural and smaller communities just don't have the resources to take complex water projects from an idea through planning and design and into construction. So they may have the money, but they don't have the other resources that's needed to put projects on the ground. That has to be beefed up. Technical support for all agency functions. I know the state engineer wants to create a technical services division that would provide technical support for everything the agency does, and that needs to be much more substantially staffed than it is today. And then specifically, the task force recommends that active water resources management, which is a scheme that was developed in the early 2000s. The rules were promulgated by the state engineer in 2004. The rules were litigated. They went all the way to the New Mexico Supreme Court, who upheld the statute upon which the rules were based and the general regulations. So we have a set of great concepts and regulations that are on the books, but the state engineer doesn't have the capacity to deploy them as the legislature intended when it passed the law in 2003.
Norm, can we go back? Just want to add something. Thank you for letting me interrupt you. So one of the things I missed when I was talking about our task force was that we had a number of legislators that were advisors, but because between everything we've talked about that is the challenge before us and this slide that Norm has now very comprehensively gone through regarding the coming session is the legislature. And these are our wonderful, hardworking New Mexicans from around the state that that do tremendous amount of work for us all. So I just wanted to put in the chat, so I didn't forget this key component, a listing. Hopefully this is right. Hopefully that shows up adequately in your chat box. These are all of the legislators that we had as legislative advisors to our task force. And I'm going to give a shout out to my legislator, Representative Lujan, who is playing a critical role on a lot of water leadership topics, but I neglected to highlight the role of these folks who really are going to be the bridge from the work of the task force into the mechanics of the legislature this session and in sessions to come. So thank you for letting me interrupt you there, Norm. I sort of skipped over this important part of our task force earlier.
Thank you, Kyle. That is critically important. So I've gone over recommendation 2.1, which was basically to modernize our state agencies and equip them to do the job that we need them to do for us. The second recommendation is to elevate regional water planning in the face of increasing water scarcity to promote equity and to build capacity to govern and manage water. Planning is so important. And we haven't done it well in New Mexico. The specific ideas that the task force has brought forward, the specific recommendations that bear on 2023 legislation and funding would be to pass a law that basically replaces the 1987 Regional Water Planning Statute. And to explain why that needs to be replaced, I want to tell just a little story. Part of New Mexico's water history is that the state engineer didn't declare his jurisdiction over groundwater in New Mexico along the Rio Grande south of Elephant Butte, from Elephant Butte, to the Texas state line. He didn't declare his jurisdiction until El Paso had already begun plans to drill a great number of water supply wells for El Paso in the Mesilla Valley in New Mexico. Well, that was defeated, and a recommendation was made to the legislature that was the genesis of the 1987 statute. And it was a really simple concept that all New Mexico needed to do was to show a need for all the water that it had. And so that was the objective of regional water planning in the law that was passed then and is still on the books. It didn't call for implementation. It didn't call for the plans to be approved. They were accepted by the Interstate Stream Commission after a very cursory presentation. It was all pro forma. And the plans, then nothing happened to them because there was no emphasis on implementation. The regional water planning program in New Mexico has gotten a bad name with some legislators because the reports it's produced are characterized as shelf reports. Kyle used that term earlier. I first heard the term from Legislative Finance Committee staff. But I think what people don't recognize is shelf reports is exactly what the law that's still on the books today calls for. It didn't call for anything else. And we need much more than shelf reports. The regional water plans, the legislation needs to establish the goals and desired impacts for regional and community water planning across New Mexico. It needs to establish criteria for the state to fund and approve robust regional water resilience planning and the plans that come out of that. Those plans need to be produced by regional water resilience planning entities. Those entities have to be authorized, and then the Interstate Stream Commission, presumably as the water planning agency of New Mexico, will need to help those entities create themselves. And the statute needs specifically to address that we need community-based and science-informed sustainable groundwater management plans, particularly in the areas of the state where groundwater is the sole source of water supply. To implement these recommendations, the legislature needs to provide funding for water planning staff. and that's staff within regional water planning entities, and it's planning staff at the Interstate Stream Commission, New Mexico's water planning agency. It should be a state role to provide the science and hydrology foundation and the models upon which regional water plans are based. So the science and the hydrology needs to come from the state. It's expensive. The data and the models are complex. And the state needs to work with local community regional planning entities so that they understand the science and hydrology foundation, basically the foundation that will make plans sound and responsive to our needs. And then we have to have dedicated state agency planning staff support. These are people that need to actively support the regional water planning entities, and they need to be focused once plans are built and approved. They need to be implemented. And so there has to be an ongoing state agency function to do that. Recommendation 2.3 is to increase our water resilience by leveraging federal funds, particularly currently available federal funds, to ensure New Mexico's water infrastructure is modernized for 21st century needs. So we're all tired of hearing that New Mexico is the last of the states in areas. And one of the new areas that I heard as the task force began its work is New Mexico is behind all the other states in the United States of putting available federal infrastructure dollars to work. This particular recommendation has a number of aspects that I want to go over individually. First of all, the state has windfall revenues currently. They've been around for some time. They haven't flowed yet to water. We need some of those, the windfall revenues now to help secure New Mexico's water future. It would just be a tragedy if some of those windfall revenues, which I understand are going to last for several years, isn't dedicated to water. We need to expand and consolidate existing mechanisms to vet proposed projects that are brought up, they're basically brought from the ground up by the political subdivisions of the state, the counties, the cities, the municipalities. They have infrastructure projects. Many of them are eligible or would be eligible to build with federal funds, but they need state matching funds and they need further development. So we have to figure out a way now to beef up our vetting so that we can capture federal funding that's available now and put those dollars to work before other states use them all up. We need to require that regional plans include descriptions, objectives, and budgets for community-supported water projects. So one purpose of the regional plans is to be the vetting across regions of the infrastructure that is needed within the region to make our water supply and our water users more resilient in the future. Water planning has a huge role. But just to clarify, there's two types of projects that would be funded by a water resilience fund that is set up to provide the non-federal matching dollars to capture the federal funds to build these projects. One type are the projects that already exist and could be vetted and funded with the help from the state. And the other are plans that come up and are vetted through the regional water planning process. So that would be the fourth bullet here. And then there's a specific idea that the task force came up with, and that is to capture enough of the current federal infrastructure funding that's available right now to develop an essential, modern, and dedicated statewide groundwater monitoring network. Another recommendation that you don't see on this page is to also try to capture federal infrastructure funding so that we can meter all of the withdrawals of water, all of the diversions of water, all of the wells in groundwater basins that the state engineer deems critical. The Water Management and Planning Task Force, the Water Management and Planning recommendations of the task force include 3 recommendations that deal with the largest water users in the state, and those are our agricultural users. I'm not going to speak to those in detail tonight, but there was consensus of the task force, unanimous consensus, as a matter of fact, that we must support agricultural communities and the stakeholders and make funding available to them and make sure that they have the opportunity to fully participate in the water management and planning programs that we must implement. So what this boils down to is it really is a call to action. It's urgent, it's crucially important, and it's urgent. And I think that now is the time for us to respectfully demand that the 2023 legislature and our governor pivot to protect water. We need to make the pivot in 2023. The Water Task Force recommendations are lengthy and complex. There's 110 specific actions that are recommended. It will take a minimum of 4 or 5 years to fully implement them. But we need to begin in 2023. That's my crucial message to you. We must begin. We cannot survive under status quo water management. We need to pass and sign. We need to get the legislators to pass and the governor to sign 2023 legislation that would authorize, provide statutory direction, provide criteria, basically to set the framework for the work that the agencies and those of us who live in the state will need to do. And in 2023, we need to secure the first increment of increased funding and staffing. There are, as I said, windfall revenues right now. I think we have an opportunity for the legislature to appropriate one-time funds that are not recurring, to use for one-time expenditures over the next 4 or 5 years to turn the ship that we were on, pivot to this new direction and make it work. We need to begin in 2023 to modernize and build state agency staff and capacity and productivity. And remember, when I talked about modernization, it was with respect to business processes, information systems, and just the general ways of the agency getting its work done. And in 2023, we need legislation that directs the agencies to provide the groundwork and foundation for 2024 and beyond. I don't think we're going to get it all done in 1 year. So that's just a high-level summary. I would urge you to get a hold of the task force report when it's implemented. There is a short narrative that I think is very readable. The recommendations are lengthy and much more detailed than this high-level summary that I've given you. And then, of course, there are the recommendations that deal with local capacity and watershed, river, and aquifer health that will be discussed on December 2nd. I have one more slide that I want to show you, and this is not a task force recommendation or slide. The task force decided early on that it would not deal with local or regional problems. And those of us who live in the Middle Rio Grande in New Mexico have a severe water management problem, namely a pending additional violation of the Rio Grande Compact debt limit. I'm not going to go over this in detail, but what I want to point out is look at this trend. The trend is bad. This is nothing new. It's not been going on. As recently as 2015, I heard people deny that we had a problem with supply and demand, but clearly we do. I do want to let you know that until very recently, the outlook for 2022 accounting looked grim. But I understand, because I've seen an unsigned Rio Grande Compact Commission resolution that says that 32,500 acre feet of water that was taken from New Mexico's credit water in Elephant Butte Reservoir in 2010, and that contributed to this big drop, will be restored to the compact balance. And I expect that the line in 2022 will be anywhere from a slight decrease to a slight increase. We're anxiously awaiting the compact counting results, which will be available at the end of the year from the Interstate Stream Commission. So that concludes my presentation, and thank you for staying with me through that long presentation.
Well, thank you, Norm and Kyle. It's a lot to digest, but so complete in terms of giving the picture of our state of aridification and what we're looking at, and the hard work and good recommendations from the task force. Let me start here, Kyle. You had a chance perhaps to look at the chat. Are there a couple of questions you picked out, or do you want me to highlight some?
Thank you for that. There was a comment by Laura Lucero, a long time colleague, who asked about the water and land use regulatory disconnect. And I think that's a very interesting observation. At one point, there was a smart growth initiative, I think nationally, and here in New Mexico, it's been, I think, replaced or transmogrified into other things in recent decades, but really looking at how to account for the water demand of new construction and new industries. And I do agree with Laura that there's a role for sort of the non-water part of planning, the land use planning part. So I don't know if I quite got Laura's comments accurate, but I do think that water folks tend to stay in this silo a little bit, and it's very important to make sure we are reckoning with some of the land use decisions that we're making as a community. So that was one speaker and one comment that had some resonance for me.
Let me add to that quickly, Kyle.
Sure.
I heard the state engineer say at a task force meeting that it's not just the state that needs to step up, but it's also the counties and the municipalities that have land use controls. They have to recognize the limits of the water resource when they approve new land uses.
Yeah,
it's crucial.
And that goes from both legislative to county to city land use decisions. There was a whole section in the chat about how to convert the task force recommendations into specific legislation. Norm, would you like to talk a little bit about the important work that's happening kind of from now to the session and presumably the coming sessions?
Well, task force members are working together to, not as the task force, but just members working with each other to pull together some bills for the legislature. At a recent presentation by a few task force members, I presented before the Water and Natural Resources Committee. We got questions from legislators and an assertion that as volunteer legislators, they need actionable recommendations. And what that means to me is bills. So the water advocates proposed, really as the task force was just beginning, proposed 4 bills. And they correspond to task force recommendations 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3. So those bills would be one to deal with the state capacity and policy issues, one to reauthorize robust regional water planning in New Mexico, and the third would be to create this water resilience fund. There are at least 2 other pieces of legislation that are being discussed, and I think that members are working on. One deals with implementing improvements to local capacity, and the other deals with implementing changes to protect watershed, river, and aquifer health. So we hope to have a robust set of bills for the legislature to consider in 2023. Those will need to be coordinated. We don't have much time left, but we are dedicated to getting those bills prepared and ready for the legislature to decide what to do with them.
That's great, Norm. Before we turn to Representative Lujan's question, I just wanted to point out that when I presented on a similar presentation to a large group of lawyers at a continuing legal education conference earlier this fall, I really advocated for them to go back to their clients and talk about these reports that are of common interest, and to alert their clients that they, lawyers, as well as engineers and advocates and water quality professionals and all the various sectors and skill sets that come together on water, really just need to plan for a big lift. And it's not going to, I was smiling earlier, Norm, when you were providing some rosy estimates of how many sessions it's going to take to implement all of the task force recommendations. Those of you who have been around legislation know it takes often takes a number of years to make a structural change, which I think a lot of these recommendations are pointing to. But we should ask an expert. Representative Lujan, did you have your hand raised?
I do. I first want to thank you, Kyle and Norm, for all the work that you've done and continue to do, and everybody else that's participating and understands the concern at hand right now. My voice is a little hoarse, but I'm well. I'm not sick. It's just a little bronchial thing going on. But I do have an open draft that I've been working on, and the state engineer is aware of it, as well as our agencies. So there's a lot of moving pieces that are going on. And I didn't make the last committee meeting for Water and Natural Resources, which I'm a member of. But I'd like to suggest that we put legislators that are really interested alongside with you and with our secretaries and with our state engineer, and really and just facilitate where we're going to move those pieces of legislation. And I am happy at any time to open any piece of legislation for a draft and to really facilitate and work through the process so that we are meeting the needs right now, which of course we're not, but we're going to meet the standard of which you're addressing and planning how this legislation gets through in the next couple of sessions, with this next session being the most crucial. So I think that I would like to have some kind of feedback from you guys, because I'm willing to put a meeting together and get our legislators in there, especially those that were on the advisory committee who were ushered through because of Representative Patty Lundstrom. She really spearheaded that we that advisory legislation group, and we've been working together and understanding what's going on with the task force.